Tesla CEO Elon Musk sent Twitter into an uproarious stupor after tweeting about the war in Ukraine. He wrote in poll form, Ukraine-Russia peace. Redo elections of annexed regions under UN supervision. Russia leaves if that is the will of the people. Crimea formally part of Russia as it has been since 1783 until Khrushchev's mistake. Water supply to Crimea assured. Ukraine remains neutral.
Musk goes on later in the thread, this is highly likely to be the outcome in the end, just a question of how many die before then. Also worth noting that a possible, albeit unlikely, outcome from this conflict is nuclear war. Venture capitalist and founder of Get Callin, David Sachs, responded to the backlash against Musk, saying, the fact that Elon Musk could be attacked as, quote, pro-Russian merely for suggesting a possible peace deal, even though he gave Starlink to the Ukrainian war effort, shows how warped and intolerant the public conversation has become. David joins us now to discuss. Welcome, David. Thank you for coming on.
Good to be here.
So you've been very vocal throughout this conflict in support of de-escalation and peace. Talk us through what that's been like given the climate in the discourse more generally.
Well, you can see in the response to Elon, and I've been seeing this response for months, that you get an army of Ukrainian sock puppets and bots, as well as scores of blue checks denouncing you and telling you to stay in your lane if you advocate for peace or any kind of diplomatic solution. What was extraordinary about what happened here with Elon is that Zelensky himself weighed in to unleash this Twitter mob against him. And what Zelensky basically said is that if you support a potential peace deal, if you merely float one, then you are basically pro-Russian. You're on the Russian side. He created this sharp dichotomy where you're either pro-Russia or you're pro-Ukraine. And if you want any kind of diplomatic deal, you are pro-Russian. Of course, then you had neocons like David Frum weigh in. Frum basically said that he said without any evidence whatsoever that Elon was floating a, quote, trial balloon on behalf of Russian sources with this peace deal. So basically accusing Elon of being a Kremlin agent here. And this is sort of par for the course. But I think what's new here is just that any expression of support for anything but escalation now is deemed to be Putin talking points. And so what's left? I mean, this is a real shrinking of the Overton window that they're trying to engineer. They're trying to basically suppress our discourse here so that there's only one acceptable position to take, which is towards greater escalation.
Yeah, absolutely. And you noted the kind of stay in your lane criticism you get and others have gotten as if our lane isn't not wanting nuclear war a lane that maybe the entire human race could happily occupy. The failure to acknowledge that any conflict ends with unless it escalates into actual nuclear war, it's going to end with some kind of agreement, some kind of arrangement, some kind of peace deal that will probably leave, no one will be entirely satisfied with what happens there. But, so many of us are watching the U.S.'s kind of just totally open-ended commitment. It's reiterated as an open-ended commitment every time Biden or other the State Department officials, other people talk about it. We're like, well, if it's this open-ended commitment, why aren't we also putting pressure on them to go to the table, to talk about a peace deal, because we don't want this conflict to go on. And that's a part that when you see the response from the people you're describing, blue check people, Zelensky himself. And look, I don't think anyone begrudges Zelensky himself trying to win this conflict, but why is he taking time out, to harass Elon Musk, who put forth a plan that, ideas that strike me as totally reasonable, probably you, and honestly, most Americans who do not seem nearly as committed to this at all costs, whatever it takes struggle as our officials or the kind of elite consensus does.
Right, and we appear to be making the great mistake of World War I, which was the handing out of blank check guarantees by great powers to minor powers, and that pulled those great powers into a much larger conflagration. What should have been a relatively minor sort of border war, it should have been the Third Balkans War, got basically blown up into the First World War because these blank check guarantees. That's what basically Zelensky is asking for here in terms of unconditional support from the U.S., no strings attached, give us unlimited weapons and money, but you're not allowed to have a point of view on how this gets resolved. And it's more than that. Not only is he demanding that, he is basically personally engineering this he's leading this Twitter mob in terms of policing dissent and closing the Overton window and suggesting that if you have any view other than towards greater and greater escalation, you are basically a Putin apologist or sympathizer, or you're actively supporting Russia. So that is basically the thing to be concerned about, is the way in which our own political discourse is now being narrowed in such a way that no position is acceptable except towards greater escalation. So we have here the creation of a one-way ratchet. Where does it lead? I think Elon brought up a good point, which is specifically on this issue of Crimea. Russia sees Crimea as their territory. It has been since 2014. The vast majority of the population in Crimea is Russian. And if you try to take that away, which is a stated war aim of Zelensky in Ukraine, and it's actually State Department policy that Crimea needs to go back to Ukraine. So if you try to engineer that outcome, if the war becomes such a rout that basically is in the cards, it is likely that Russia would be willing to use nuclear weapons to prevent that total defeat. So, I think it is a very legitimate issue to raise, which is, where does this end? Do we have to support Ukraine to the point where they are now trying to retake Crimea? Because if we do, I do think there's a substantial likelihood that this escalates into a nuclear conflict, if not before. And it's not
I think
on behalf of the principle of self-determination, because I think the vast majority of people who live in Crimea would like to be part of Russia.
I could not agree with you more. The question of self-determination here is key. And what is so interesting to me is that in March, Zelensky himself put on the table, agreement to the exact proposal that Elon Musk tweeted yesterday. In an interview with John Muir, he said that he was, withdrawing his request to join NATO, right? So there you have the neutrality. He said that he was willing to negotiate on Crimea. And he said the question of the Donbas region would be determined based on how the Ukrainians living there themselves wanted it to be determined, that was the major sticking point for him, but he was open to negotiations. And so as recently as March, Zelensky himself had agreed to these exact conditions. And now when Elon Musk puts it out there, having spent $80 million of his personal money to ensure that Ukrainians can stay online with Starlink, Zelensky now shows up on Twitter to troll him.
Right. So you're right. So basically back in March, Zelensky was spouting Putin talking points. What's happened here, and I understand, is that Zelensky has been radicalized by the war. This is a pretty common thing that happens, is that the more losses you suffer, the more dug in and radicalized you become. And this is why wars escalate and peace becomes impossible. And I can understand why Zelensky feels that way in light of the massive losses that Ukraine has taken in this war and how many of his countrymen have been killed. But I do not think it is appropriate for him to try and basically narrow the Overton window of the American political discourse, as he did. He sort of personally led that effort to silence Elon Musk by branding him as some sort of Kremlin apologist and basically unleash this online horde, this sort of this Twitter cancellation mob on Elon. So he is basically trying to affect and narrow the American political discourse over this war. That is not appropriate. At the end of the day, we are interested as a country in potentially giving him aid, but we are not interested in being part of a suicide pact with him. And this is where this thing is headed.
Yeah, no, you're so right, David. We so appreciate you joining us today. Thank you so much for your thoughts on this subject.
Good to be here. Thank you.
We'll have more Rising right after this.